Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking into the often overlooked world of habits.
Okay.
And we're going to be taking some key insights from Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit.
hmm
So you ever stop and think about how many of your daily actions are actually driven by these unconscious habits?
Right.
Things like brushing your teeth or even just like picking up your phone and
Well,
scrolling.
yeah, definitely.
I know I do.
It's almost scary how automatic some of that stuff is.
Yeah, and today we're going to kind of uncover how those habits work, how they can be changed, and the surprising impact they have, not just on us as individuals, but on entire organizations and even social movements.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because when people think about habits, they often think of them as these like mundane or even insignificant things.
Right.
But they can be these really powerful forces in our lives.
Definitely. And to illustrate that, Duhigg starts his book with this really compelling story
Okay.
about a military major in Kufa, Iraq,
Oh, wow.
who was tasked with quelling these riots that were happening.
Uh-huh.
And you wouldn't typically associate riot control with habit psychology, would you?
No, not really.
But this major, he's actually a self-described hick, he discovered that by understanding the habits of the community,
Yeah.
he could actually influence their behavior in a major way.
That's incredible.
So how'd he do it?
Well, he realized that every evening people would gather in the town square.
Okay.
And these gatherings were basically a breeding ground for unrest. It's where people would kind of air their grievances.
So they would congregate,
Yeah.
and that's how these riots would start.
Exactly.
So he saw that habit, and he wanted to change it.
Yeah, so instead of trying to shut down the gatherings altogether, he worked with local leaders to transform them
Okay.
into opportunities for dialogue
Mhm.
and community building.
Wow. So they were still allowed to gather,
Right.
but instead of it being like this breeding ground for these riots,
Right.
it became like a more peaceful thing.
Exactly. It was a subtle shift, but it had this huge ripple effect.
That's a pretty powerful example
It really is.
of how understanding habits can be applied in these unexpected ways.
And it applies on a personal level, too, you
Yeah.
know? Think about your own life for a second.
Yeah,
How many of the things that you do every day are driven by unconscious habits?
definitely. I mean, we talked about just the simple act of scrolling through your phone.
Exactly, or brushing your teeth.
Yeah, driving to work.
All those things.
It's kind of wild when you really think about it.
It is. It's like we're on autopilot most of the time,
Yeah.
guided by these ingrained patterns of behavior.
And to understand how those patterns develop, Duhigg goes into the neuroscience behind habit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he introduces us to this man named Eugene Pauly,
Okay.
who had a really unique condition.
What was that?
He actually lost his memory due to viral encephalitis.
Wow.
So this man couldn't remember facts or events,
Mm-hmm.
but his brain could still learn and store automatic behaviors.
So even though he couldn't remember things consciously,
Right.
he could still form new habits.
Exactly. And that was because a specific part of his brain called the basal ganglia,
Okay.
which is crucial for habit formation,
Uh-huh.
was still intact.
So that area of the brain was sort of working independently.
Yeah, it was really fascinating.
That is wild.
And Duhigg gives this relatable example of how this worked in Eugene's case.
Okay.
So even though he couldn't remember things,
Right.
he would repeatedly make breakfast
Uh-huh.
even when he wasn't hungry.
He would just do it automatically.
Yeah, he was driven by cues like the morning light.
Oh, wow. So just seeing the sun come up would trigger this whole routine.
Exactly. And it's kind of like how you back your car out of the driveway every morning without even really thinking about it.
Oh, yeah. It's totally automatic.
You've done it so many times that your basal ganglia is just like, I got this.
That makes sense.
And that's essentially what's at the heart of the habit loop.
The habit loop.
Yeah, it's this three-part cycle.
Okay.
It starts with a cue,
Mm-hmm.
which could be anything from a specific time of day to a certain location, or even an emotional state.
Okay.
Then you've got the routine.
So that's the actual behavior itself.
Yep, the series of actions that you take, and
Mhm.
finally there's the reward.
And that's what reinforces the habit, makes you want to do it again.
Exactly.
So in Eugene's case, the morning light was the cue.
Yeah.
Cooking breakfast was the routine.
Mm-hmm.
And the reward was, well, the act of cooking itself, even if he didn't actually eat food.
Right. And that's the crazy part.
It is pretty wild.
But it shows how powerful these loops can be.
It does.
And the cool thing is, once you understand this habit loop,
Yeah.
you can actually start to change your habits.
So it's not just about trying to force yourself to stop doing something.
Right. It's about understanding the mechanics and then tweaking the pattern.
Exactly. It's like rewiring your brain.
That's a great way to put it.
And there's one more element that's really important when it comes to making those changes stick.
Okay, what's that?
It's craving.
Craving, like
Yeah.
actually wanting to do the habit.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like that anticipation, the desire for the reward. That's what really kind of solidifies the habit in our
Because
brains.
you're saying it's not enough to just go through the motions. You actually have to want to do it.
Right, you have to crave it.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this craving element adds a whole new layer to understanding habits.
It's a game changer.
Do you have a good example of how this plays out in real life?
Well, Duhigg talks about this guy, Claude Hopkins,
Okay.
who was like a legendary ad man back in the day.
Uh-huh.
And he basically revolutionized marketing by tapping into this power of craving.
Okay, now we're talking marketing. That's everywhere.
Yeah.
What did Hopkins do that was so groundbreaking?
Well, he's the guy who made Pepsodent toothpaste.
Toothpaste.
Yeah, Pepsodent toothpaste, a global phenomenon.
Okay, but how do you create a craving for toothpaste?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound very exciting.
That's what everyone thought at the time. Toothpaste wasn't exactly a hot commodity, you know?
Right.
But Hopkins was a genius at understanding human psychology,
Okay.
and he figured out how to create a craving.
So what was his secret?
Well, he identified a universal cue. That filmy feeling we all get on our teeth.
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling.
Right, everyone's got it.
Uh-huh.
And the routine was simple, brushing your teeth.
Okay, so far so good. But where's the craving?
Ah, that's the brilliant part. It wasn't just about having clean teeth or fresh breath. Hopkins focused on the tingling sensation that Pepsodent created.
So he basically engineered a craving for that specific feeling.
Exactly. People started associating that tingle with the feeling of clean teeth, and boom!
They had to have it.
Everyone was craving Pepsodent.
Wow, that's a really interesting example of how a small tweak can make a huge difference.
It really is.
But how do we know for sure that craving is the key ingredient when it comes to habits?
Well, Duhigg contrasts Pepsodent's success with another product from the same company,
Okay,
Febreze.
the air freshener.
Yeah, and initially it was a total flop.
Really? I use Febreze all the time.
Hmm.
I would have thought that would be an easy sell.
You'd think so, right? I mean, the cue was bad smells.
Yeah.
The routine was spraying Febreze,
Mm-hmm.
and the reward was a nice, fresh-smelling home.
Seems like a solid formula. What went wrong?
There was no craving.
Yeah.
People didn't realize they needed Febreze. They weren't craving that feeling of relief and satisfaction that comes from eliminating bad odors.
So even with a clear cue routine and reward, a habit won't stick without that craving element.
It's the glue that holds it all together.
That's fascinating. So what about bad habits? Can we just get rid of them completely?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Well, Duhigg argues that you can't really extinguish bad habits. You can
Ah.
only change them.
Interesting. So it's not about willpower then?
Willpower alone isn't usually enough. It's about understanding that habit loop and using it to your advantage.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, Duhigg talks about this football coach named Tony Dungy,
Okay.
who had incredible success transforming losing teams.
Uh-huh.
And his secret was focusing on this principle of changing habits rather than trying to eliminate them.
Interesting. What was his approach?
He called it the golden rule of habit change.
Okay. I like it already.
And it's pretty simple. You use the same cue,
Mm-hmm.
provide the same reward, but you change the routine.
Can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. So Dungy noticed that his players had this bad habit of panicking when the opposing team ran a certain play.
Okay.
So the cue was that specific play.
Yeah.
The routine was panicking and making mistakes,
And the reward.
losing the game.
Ouch.
Yeah, so he couldn't eliminate the cue because that was part of the game,
Right.
and he couldn't change the reward because obviously everyone wants to win.
So he focused on the routine.
Exactly. He drilled his players over and over on a new response to that play, a set of calm, controlled, effective behaviors to replace that old panic-driven routine.
So instead of trying to suppress the old habit, he replaced it with a new one.
Exactly.
That's pretty clever.
It is, and it can be applied to all sorts of habits.
Okay, so let's say I want to stop stress eating. How would I use this golden rule?
Well, first you got to identify the cue. What triggers the stress eating?
I guess feeling overwhelmed at work.
Okay, so that's the cue.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the routine?
Go to the vending machine for a bag of chips.
All right, and what's the reward?
A temporary feeling of comfort, I guess? Or maybe just a distraction from the stress?
Okay, so we can't eliminate the cue because work stress is a reality,
Right.
and we can't eliminate the desire for comfort or relief.
So we change the routine.
Exactly. Instead of hitting the vending machine, what could you do that would provide a similar reward, but in a healthier way?
I could take a 5-minute break to do some deep breathing exercises
Perfect.
or go for a quick walk outside.
There you go. Same cue, same reward, but a different routine.
This is really making me rethink how I approach my own habits.
It's a powerful framework.
And Duhigg takes it even further. He talks about how this principle is at work in Alcoholics Anonymous.
AA is a great example of this.
In what way?
Well, AA basically functions as this giant habit-changing system.
Yeah.
It provides people with new routines to replace the ones associated with drinking.
So instead of just saying don't drink, they give people a whole new set of behaviors to adopt.
Exactly. They have meetings for support, they have sponsors for accountability,
Yeah.
and the 12 steps provide a structured framework for change.
So all of these things work together to break the old habit loop and create a new one.
That's the idea.
And Duhigg also mentions the role of belief in all of this. How does belief factor into AA's success?
Well, researchers have found that having a belief in something bigger than yourself,
Okay.
whether it's God or a spiritual force or even just the power of the group itself, can really help people stay sober.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you believe you can change, the more likely you are to succeed.
It's like creating this positive feedback loop.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that idea of craving that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
If you believe in the process and you crave the rewards that come with sobriety,
You're much more likely to stick with it.
this whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm starting to see how powerful these forces are in our lives.
They really are. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore how this understanding of habit can be applied to organizations and even social movements.
I can't wait.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, right?
Definitely. And so far, we've mainly focused on how habits impact us as individuals.
Right.
But I'm curious about how this plays out on a larger scale. Like, can entire companies have habits?
Oh, absolutely. They can, and they're often just as powerful as our personal habits.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. Every organization has its own way of doing things, right?
Yeah.
They have established routines, processes, ways of communicating. All of that reflects the company's habits.
So it's not just about individual employees having good or bad habits. It's about the company as a whole having these collective patterns of behavior.
Exactly. Duhigg calls them organizational habits.
Okay. And how do these organizational habits form?
They usually emerge gradually, over time as thousands of employees make decisions and interact with each other.
So it's like all these individual actions sort of coalesce into these unwritten rules and procedures.
Right. And these habits can be incredibly influential. They can shape everything from product development to marketing strategies to hiring decisions.
Wow. So can you give me an example of how these organizational habits might play out in a real company?
Sure. Imagine a clothing company that's trying to decide what color to feature on the cover of their next catalog.
Okay.
Seems like a pretty straightforward decision, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
But beneath the surface, there's this whole web of organizational habits that are influencing that choice.
Like what?
Well, maybe the VP of marketing has a habit of browsing Japanese fashion blogs, and she notices that there's a trend towards a particular shade of red. Or maybe the designers have a habit of asking their friends what colors are in style.
Right.
And they hear that a competitor is using a certain shade of blue.
So all of these little habits, all of these seemingly insignificant actions actually feed into the decision-making process.
They do. And eventually a decision emerges. Not necessarily through some grand strategic plan, but through the convergence of all these organizational habits.
Kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. All these unconscious patterns influencing what we think of as conscious choices.
It is. And it highlights how important it is to be aware of these organizational habits. Because just like personal habits, they can be both good and bad.
So how can companies make sure that their habits are working for them rather than against them?
Well, Duhigg talks about this idea of organizational truces.
Okay.
These are basically unspoken agreements that maintain stability within a company.
So everyone agrees to play by the rules, even if those rules aren't always ideal.
Right. And these truces can be useful. They can prevent chaos and conflict, but they can also lead to complacency, a resistance to change.
And in some cases, those truces can actually be really dangerous, right?
Exactly. Duhigg uses the example of the King's Cross fire in London.
Oh, yeah, that was a terrible tragedy.
It was. In 1987, a fire broke out in the King's Cross underground station, and 31 people died.
And the investigation found that a lot of it had to do with the organizational habits at the station.
Right. There was this habit of ignoring small fires.
Really?
Yeah, employees just assumed they would burn themselves out.
Wow.
And there was this really rigid chain of command that discouraged people from taking initiative or speaking up about potential hazards.
So basically a combination of complacency and poor communication created this perfect storm.
Exactly. And it's a stark reminder of how important it is to constantly examine and reassess organizational habits.
Especially in high-stakes environments.
Absolutely. And Duhigg argues that good leaders actually see moments of crisis as opportunities.
Opportunities.
Yeah, opportunities to break bad habits and create new ones.
So how can organizations go about creating those positive habits?
It's not always easy.
Yeah.
You can't just issue a memo and expect everyone to change overnight. Duhigg suggests that leaders need to create a sense of urgency, make it clear that the old ways of doing things are no longer acceptable.
Okay.
And he also emphasizes the importance of identifying keystone habits.
Keystone habits. What are those?
They're habits that have a ripple effect. They trigger positive changes in other areas of the organization.
It's about like a domino effect.
Exactly. You focus on one key habit, and it sets off a chain reaction of improvements.
Do you have a good example of a keystone habit in action?
Yeah, one of the best examples is Paul O'Neill, the former CEO of Alcoa.
Okay.
When O'Neill took over, Alcoa was struggling,
Mm-hmm.
and he surprised everyone by saying that his top priority was worker safety.
Worker safety. That seems like an unusual focus for a CEO trying to turn a company around.
That's what everyone thought. But O'Neill understood the power of keystone habits. He knew that if he could make Alcoa the safest company in the world, it would have all sorts of positive ripple effects.
Interesting. And did it work?
It did. Alcoa's safety record improved dramatically. But it wasn't just about reducing accidents. The focus on safety forced managers to communicate more effectively.
Mm.
Employees started taking more ownership of their work. And the whole organization adopted this more data-driven approach to problem solving.
So the habit of prioritizing safety created this cascade of positive changes.
Exactly. It transformed Alcoa's culture and ultimately its bottom line.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into the power of habit.
It really is.
We've explored how habits work in our brains, the role of craving the impact of habits on organizations.
And how we can use this knowledge to make positive changes.
Exactly. And it's a bit humbling to realize how much of our lives is actually driven by these unconscious patterns.
It is. But it's also empowering to know that we have the ability to change those patterns.
Right. We're not just robots acting out these pre-programmed routines.
Mhm.
We can actually choose which habits we want to cultivate and which ones we want to change.
And that's the key takeaway here. Habits are not destiny.
If there's one thing I've learned from this deep dive, it's that we have way more control over our lives than we think.
I agree with that.
By understanding how habits work,
Yep.
and by consciously choosing the habits we want to develop, we can design the lives we want.
One step at a time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this journey into the world of habits. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to think about your own habits. Which ones serve you well? Which ones are holding you back? And what small changes can you make today to start building the life you want, one habit at a time? This is The Deep Dive signing off.